So, let's go. Number 1. Joya De Cerén. In a small farming village in what is now El Salvador, a cook set a clay pot of beans down beside a warm hearth one evening and never came back for it. The sky had turned the color of ash. Within hours, the whole village was gone, sealed under wet, volcanic dust so completely that those beans are still in that pot today, roughly 14 centuries later. The village is called Joya De Cerén, and it died around the year 660. Less than 1 kilometer away, a small volcanic vent called the Loma Caldera tore open. It was a phreatomagmatic eruption, meaning rising magma slammed into groundwater and flashed it to steam, blasting out fine, wet ash. That ash fell in 14 separate layers and buried the settlement 4 to 8 meters deep. No one knew any of this until 1976, when a bulldozer clearing ground for grain silos cut into a buried clay structure. The archaeologist Payson Sheets from the University of Colorado Boulder began excavations in 1978, and what he uncovered rewrote what we knew about ordinary Maya life. Most Maya archaeology is about kings and stone temples. Cerén was about farmers. Because the ash was wet and cooled fast, it hardened around everything before it could rot. The diggers found thatched roofs, woven sleeping mats, cords, wooden tools, and painted gourds. In the fields, they poured plaster into the hollow spaces left by decayed plants and cast the exact shape of young maize, growing in ridged rows. This is the same trick used at Pompeii to recover the shapes of the dead. More than 70 buildings have been mapped, including homes, storehouses, a communal steam bath made of adobe, and a building used by a shaman. One structure, labeled Structure 12 by the excavators, appears to have been used for religious divination, while another, Structure 10, may have hosted communal feasting. Inside the vessels, researchers found beans, chilies, and cacao. A meal sat half-finished. Obsidian blades were tucked up in the roof thatch for safekeeping. Even a mouse was caught in the ash. Ground-penetrating radar and continued digging keep revealing more buildings still sealed beneath the deep tephra, so the true size of the village is not yet known. It was named a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1993. Here is what makes Cerén so important. There are no bodies. The people saw the warning signs and ran, leaving their entire world set out exactly as it was on an ordinary evening. The region had been devastated before by the enormous Ilopango eruption around the year 431, and people had slowly moved back and rebuilt. Cerén shows they never truly escaped the danger. The lesson is not about a giant, famous volcano. It is about a small vent most people have never heard of, one that erased an entire living community in a matter of hours. El Salvador today is packed with people living in the shadow of active volcanoes, going about ordinary evenings, exactly as the villagers of Cerén once did. Number 2. Atlit-Yam. Off the coast of Israel, a marine archaeologist named Ehud Galili switched on his torch in 1984 and swam into the streets of a village that had been underwater for 9,000 years, its skeletons still lying where people had once slept. Atlit-Yam sits 8 to 12 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean, a few hundred meters off the town of Atlit, south of Haifa. It was a farming and fishing community from the late Stone Age, occupied roughly between 6,900 and 6,300 BCE. It is one of the largest and best preserved sunken villages of its age anywhere on Earth. At its heart stands something strange. 7 large stones, some weighing 600 kilograms, are arranged in a semicircle around what was once a freshwater spring. Archaeologists believe this was a ritual site, perhaps a water cult, built to honor the source of life. That stone circle is around 3,000 years older than Stonehenge. The marine clay preserved things that almost never survive. There are rectangular stone house foundations, hearths, and storage pits. There are human skeletons, still articulated, including a woman and a child buried together. 2 of the skeletons carry the earliest confirmed cases of tuberculosis, identified through ancient DNA of the bacterium. Others show a bony growth in the ear canal called surfer's ear, which forms from repeated diving in cold water. These people were not simple. They kept cattle, goats, and pigs. They grew wheat, barley, lentils, and flax, and they fished the deep sea in an organized way, leaving behind net weights and stacks of cleaned fish, as if the catch had been prepared, and then suddenly abandoned. That stacked, cleaned catch is one of the site's most telling details, because it suggests people left in a hurry and never returned to collect it. The tuberculosis found in the bones is significant on its own, pushing the confirmed history of that disease back thousands of years and showing it already traveled with early farming communities. Why did it end so abruptly? In 2007, a team led by Maria Pereschi at Italy's National Geophysics Institute proposed a dramatic answer. Around 6000 BCE, the eastern flank of Mount Etna, in Sicily, collapsed into the sea and launched a tsunami across the Mediterranean. That wave, they argued, may have struck Atlit-Yam and helped drown it. But there is a quieter killer, too. Sea levels were rising steadily as the last Ice Age glaciers melted, and the coastline was slowly going under, regardless. The village's freshwater well shows layers where the sea finally intruded and turned the water salt. That was the moment the community could no longer survive there. Whether it was a single wave in the night or a slow tightening of the sea, the result was the same. A thriving, sophisticated community, 9,000 years old, vanished beneath the water and was forgotten until one diver's torch found it again. And it is exactly the kind of drowning that rising seas threaten to repeat along crowded coastlines today. Number 3. Helike. On a winter night in 373 BCE, the people of a great Greek city looked up as the ground began to heave, and before the sun rose, the entire city and everyone in it had slid beneath the sea. The city was Helike, and it became the ancient world's most famous warning. Helike was no minor town. It was the leading city of the Achaean League, on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth, and it was sacred to Poseidon, god of both the sea and earthquakes. The ancient writers Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Pausanias all recorded its end. An earthquake struck, and within hours a tsunami rolled over the city. Every inhabitant, they wrote, was lost. Strabo added an eerie detail. For long afterward, a bronze statue of Poseidon stood upright beneath the water, and fishermen's nets kept snagging on his outstretched hand. 10 Spartan warships that had been anchored in the harbor were said to have gone down with the city. To the ancient Greeks, this was divine punishment. The people of Helike had supposedly murdered a group of Ionian suppliants at Poseidon's own altar, and the god took his revenge. The story of a proud city swallowed in a single night echoed for centuries, and many scholars believe it helped shape Plato's tale of Atlantis, written just a few decades later. Then, Helike itself was lost. Not just sunk, but misplaced. For more than 2,000 years, no one could find it, because everyone assumed it lay somewhere out in the open Gulf. In 1988, Dora Katsonopoulou and Stephen Soter launched the Helike project to search on land instead. Here is where the simple story bends. From 2001 onward, they found the classical destruction layer not in the sea, but buried in the silt of a former coastal lagoon. The city had not sailed off a cliff into deep water. The earthquake had liquefied the ground, dropped the land, and let a lagoon and then the sea pour in. Over centuries, silt covered it completely. Beneath the classical ruins, they even found an older Bronze Age settlement, destroyed and rebuilt long before. The geology explains it. The Gulf of Corinth is one of the fastest rifting places on the planet, pulling apart several millimeters every year, and the Helike Fault runs right along the shore. When the fault slipped, the land dropped in what geologists call co-seismic subsidence, and the water followed it down. Recovered coins, cobbled roads, and collapsed buildings all confirm the disaster, and excavation continues today in the fields near the modern village of Rizamilos. There is a fitting symmetry in the god the city worshipped, because Poseidon was master of both the sea and the earthquake, the very two forces that together destroyed his city. Helike is the purest version of this video's title. Not a slow decline, not an abandonment, an entire city, its harbor, and all its people, taken between dusk and dawn. And the same fault line still sits beneath the Greek coast, waiting. Number 4. Ozette. On a winter night around the year 1700, on the far northwestern tip of what is now Washington State, a rain-soaked hillside gave way and buried a row of sleeping cedar longhouses under a wall of mud, sealing an entire Maka whaling village in an instant. Ozette sat at Cape Alava, the westernmost point of the mainland United States. The mudslide that buried it is often tied to one of the most violent events in the region's history, the magnitude 9 Cascadia earthquake of January 1700. That quake ruptured the seafloor off the coast and shook the ground for minutes. For centuries, the buried houses simply waited. Then, in the winter of 1969 and 70, storm waves eroded the bank and began washing out ancient wooden objects. The archaeologist Richard Doherty of Washington State University led the excavation that followed, working hand in hand with the Maka tribe in what became a landmark of collaborative archaeology. The wet, airless mud had preserved things that normally rot away within years. More than 55,000 artifacts came out of the ground. There were cedar bark baskets, woven mats, bentwood boxes, and harpoon shafts. There was a carved wooden effigy of a whale's fin, inlaid with more than 700 sea otter teeth. Whole longhouse timbers, benches, and hearths were preserved right where they stood. The finds prove something the Maka had always said about themselves. This was a deep whaling culture, and the harpoon parts, the whale bone, and the seal bone confirmed it. The deeper layers showed around 2,000 years of continuous life at this one spot. Many of these objects now rest in the Maka Cultural and Research Center at Nia Bay, opened in 1979. The excavation did more than fill a museum. The evidence of a long, unbroken whaling tradition later helped support the tribe's treaty and whaling rights, giving physical proof to a heritage that outsiders had doubted. It is a reminder that a buried village can speak directly to the living descendants of the people who lived there. There is a haunting footnote to the 1700 quake. In Japan, a mysterious tsunami struck that same winter with no local earthquake to explain it. Scientists Kenji Satake and Brian Atwater later traced that orphan tsunami back across the Pacific to the Cascadia rupture, dating it to the night of January 26, 1700. Maka oral histories describe a night when the ground shook and houses were swallowed. The excavation ran for 11 years, from 1970 to 1981, and the quality of preservation rivals the famous wet sites of Europe. But the most sobering part is this. The Cascadia Fault is loaded again and considered overdue, which means the same disaster that buried Ozette still hangs over every coastal town in the Pacific Northwest today. Number 5. Tall El-Hammam. In the Jordan Valley, a Bronze Age city that had stood for 3,000 years came to an end so abruptly that its mud brick walls were sheared off at the same height across the whole site, as if something had flattened everything at once. What did it remains one of archaeology's fiercest arguments. Tall El-Hammam sits in the Middle Gore, northeast of the Dead Sea. It was a large fortified city with monumental ramparts and a palace, and it was abruptly destroyed around 1650 BCE, then left empty for 3 to 6 centuries. Stephen Collins has directed excavations there since 2005. In 2021, a large team including Ted Bunch and James Kennett published a paper in the journal Scientific Reports with a stunning claim. The city, they argued, was destroyed by a cosmic airburst, a meteor that exploded in the air like the one over Tunguska, Siberia, in 1908. Their evidence was dramatic. They reported shocked quartz, melted pottery and mud brick, tiny diamond-like carbon grains, and glassy spheres, all pointing to temperatures above 2,000 degrees Celsius. That is far hotter than any cooking fire, kiln, or ancient war could produce. They described a destruction layer more than 1.5 meters thick, and unusually high levels of salt, which they suggested came from Dead Sea brine scattered by the blast, salting the fields so nothing could grow. They even proposed the event might be the real memory behind the biblical story of Sodom. Now here is where the ground shifts under the whole claim. Many mainstream scientists were not convinced. Critics questioned whether the spherules and the shocked quartz were correctly identified, raised concerns about how some images were presented, and pointed out that ordinary causes had not been ruled out. An earthquake, for instance, fits well because the city sits on the Dead Sea Transform, one of the most active faults in the region. Warfare and a great fire are possible too. What almost everyone agrees on is the raw fact in the dirt. A large, thriving city was destroyed suddenly and then abandoned for centuries, and the region's other settlements emptied out at roughly the same time. The human bones in the destruction layer were found scattered and broken apart, which the airburst team read as blast damage, though critics note that collapse and fire can do the same. The abandonment itself was profound, lasting somewhere between 300 and 600 years before anyone lived on the mound again. Whatever struck the Middle Gore, it did not just topple one city, it seems to have emptied a whole cluster of settlements across the plain. The cause is still fought over in the scientific literature, and that argument matters beyond one ruined city. Airbursts are real. Tunguska flattened 2,000 square kilometers of forest. In 2013, a much smaller rock exploded over Chelyabinsk, Russia, and injured hundreds. Whatever leveled tall El-Hammam, the sky is a genuine threat, and planetary defense is now a serious science. Number 6. Cuicuilco. On the southern edge of what is now Mexico City, a river of molten rock once crossed the farmland and advanced on a massive round pyramid, swallowing one of the earliest cities in the Valley of Mexico under solid stone that is still there today. Cuicuilco flourished from around 800 BCE to about 150 CE. Its centerpiece was a circular stepped pyramid, roughly 118 meters across and 20 meters high, one of the oldest monuments in all of Mesoamerica. At its peak, the city may have held more than 20,000 people, and it was a genuine rival to a younger city rising nearby, Teotihuacan. Then a small cinder cone volcano called Ozette erupted, sometime around the years 245 to 315. Lava poured out and spread across the landscape, creating the basalt field known as the Pedregal, in places up to 10 meters thick. It buried Cuicuilco's fields, its homes, and much of its Great Pyramid under rock that never went away. In the 1920s, the archaeologist Manuel Gamio excavated the top of the pyramid out from under the hardened lava. Even now, large parts of the ancient city lie beneath modern neighborhoods and the campus of Mexico's National University, known as UNAM. The round shape of the pyramid is unusual, older than the rectangular pyramids that would later define central Mexico. Scientists have dated the eruption using both radiocarbon methods and the magnetic signature locked into the cooling lava, which records the direction of Earth's magnetic field at the moment it hardened. Lava flows are slow enough that most people almost certainly escaped, but slow does not mean survivable, because the molten rock buried the fields and homes that a whole society depended on to live. The eruption did more than destroy one city. It appears to have pushed the survivors and the region's political power toward Teotihuacan, which grew into one of the largest cities in the ancient world. In other words, a volcano may have decided which civilization would dominate the Valley of Mexico for centuries. There is debate about how complete Cuicuilco's fall really was. Some researchers think the city was already in decline before Ozette erupted, and that the lava finished off a place that was fading anyway. Radiocarbon and magnetic dating of the lava continue to refine when it happened. The deeper meaning is hard to miss. Cuicuilco is a city literally paved over, entombed by a small volcano most people have never heard of. And Mexico City, one of the largest urban areas on the planet with more than 20 million people, still sits among active volcanoes, including the restless giant Popocatépetl on its horizon. Number 7. Kourion. At dawn on the 21st of July, 365 CE, a man in the Cypriot city of Kourion threw his body over his wife, who was cradling their infant, in the last instant before the ceiling came down on all three of them. Excavators found them still locked together, 16 centuries later. Kourion was an ancient city kingdom on the southern coast of Cyprus, lived in from the Bronze Age through the early Byzantine period. It had a Greco-Roman theater carved into the hillside, a marketplace, bath complexes, and later a Christian basilica, the marks of a prosperous, cultured place. On that July morning, an enormous earthquake destroyed it, and many of its people were still asleep or just rising when the walls came down. The archaeologist David Soren of the University of Arizona uncovered the destruction in detail during the 1980s. The most famous discovery is the group now called the Earthquake House family. A young man, a young woman, and an 18-month-old child, crushed together in a final embrace. Nearby, a mule lay dead, still tethered where it had been tied. A finger ring helped date the exact moment of death. The people were caught mid-action, which tells us the quake struck suddenly at first light. This was not a local tremor. The 365 earthquake is thought to have had a magnitude near 8, one of the largest in Mediterranean history. Its rupture off the island of Crete lifted parts of the western Cretan coast up to 9 meters, an uplift you can still see today. It also launched a tsunami across the whole eastern Mediterranean. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that in Alexandria, in Egypt, the sea drew back and then surged in, throwing ships onto the rooftops of houses and drowning thousands. Kourion was partly rebuilt afterward, but it never regained its former scale. The city sits near the Cyprus Arc, where the African tectonic plate grinds beneath the Aegean, which is why the region shakes. Coins and radiocarbon dating pin the destruction tightly to the 360s. Some scholars debate whether it was a single catastrophic quake or a cluster of them striking over a short span, a seismic paroxysm. To the Christians of the age, disasters like this carried an apocalyptic weight, read as signs of divine anger or the end of the world. Modern researchers have also wrestled with the ethics of displaying the family's remains, caught in so intimate a final moment. Either way, the earthquake house remains one of the most human snapshots of instant catastrophe ever found. And the same tectonic boundary is still active, meaning the eastern Mediterranean remains primed for another morning like that one. Number 8. The Storegga Slide Tsunami. Picture a low, marshy plain stretching between Britain and mainland Europe, dotted with the camps of hunter-gatherers. When at dusk, a gray wall of water appears on the horizon and climbs across the flatland faster than anyone can run. That plain was called Doggerland, and around 6,200 BCE, the sea came for it. The cause lay far to the north. Off the coast of Norway, a colossal underwater landslide let go, one of the largest ever known on Earth. More than 3,000 cubic kilometers of seabed sediment slid away, across an area larger than Scotland. That sudden collapse shoved the ocean upward and sent a tsunami racing outward. The waves struck Norway, Scotland, the Faroe Islands, and the low plains of Doggerland. Geologists find its fingerprint as a distinctive layer of sand, and in the Shetland Islands, that sand sits 20 to 30 meters above where the shoreline stood at the time. On the open coasts, the wave may have been several meters high. Across the flat expanse of Doggerland, it would have swept far inland. For a long time, the trigger was uncertain, And this is where the science is genuinely unsettled. Some researchers point to the sudden breakdown of frozen methane deposits in the seabed. Others blame the rapid piling up of sediment after the glaciers melted, or an earthquake that shook the slope loose. The debate is still open. Doggerland was already doomed in the long run. Sea levels were climbing as the Ice Age ended, and by around 5,500 BCE, the land bridge was almost entirely underwater, cutting Britain off from the continent for good. The Storegga wave was a violent blow to a landscape already sinking. Work by researchers including David Smith and Alistair Dawson mapped how far inland the water reached, and in 2020, Vince Gaffney's project found tsunami sediment in cores from the southern North Sea, close to today's coasts. We know people lived there because trawlers still drag up peat, animal bones, and stone tools from Dogger Bank, and in 1931 a barbed antler harpoon point was hauled from the seabed, the first hard proof that Doggerland had been inhabited. Researchers now use ancient DNA and seismic mapping to rebuild the drowned landscape, tracing its lost rivers, hills, and coastlines beneath the modern North Sea. Storegga was not one clean event, but a complex of slides over time, with the giant around 6,200 BCE being the one that launched the killing wave. Some survivors likely clung to the higher ground of Doggerland for a while afterward, before the sea took that too. An entire inhabited country, with its own rivers and hills, was erased first by a wave and then by the rising sea. And submarine landslides like Storegga can still happen, which is why they remain a real tsunami hazard, especially in a warming ocean. Number 9. Thonis-Heracleion. In the year 2000, divers working in Aboukir Bay off the Egyptian coast watched the 5-meter face of a stone pharaoh rise slowly out of the murky water, the first sign of a legendary port city that had lain hidden beneath the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. The city had two names. To the Egyptians, it was Thonis. To the Greeks, Heracleion. It stood at the mouth of the Canopic branch of the Nile and served as Egypt's great customs gateway, the point where foreign ships entered the country in the centuries before Alexandria was founded in 331 BCE. It flourished from around the 8th to the 6th century BCE. Then it sank. The cause was a slow and then sudden combination of forces. The land subsided, earthquakes struck, and the clay-rich delta soil experienced what engineers call liquefaction. When saturated ground briefly behaves like liquid and heavy stone buildings simply drop into it. Over time, the whole city slid beneath the waves. It was rediscovered by the French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudiot and his team after a long survey of the bay. The city lies about 6.5 kilometers offshore, under some 10 meters of water and sediment. What they found was staggering. Colossal statues of a pharaoh, a queen, and the god of the Nile flood, Hapi, the temple of Amun-Gareb, more than 60 shipwrecks, and over 700 ancient anchors, revealing just how busy the harbor had been. Gold coins, jewelry, and stone slabs carved with royal decrees. For centuries, scholars had read the name Heracleion in the writings of Herodotus and wondered whether it was one real city or a legend. The anaerobic mud that swallowed it also preserved it, keeping wood and inscriptions intact for the divers to find. Among the finds was a carved stone slab known as the Decree of Sais, which had an almost identical twin at the nearby city of Naucratis, confirming exactly where Thonis-Heracleion stood and what laws governed its trade. Geophysical surveys have since mapped the city's grid of canals and harbor basins across the seafloor. The discoveries rewrote our understanding of trade and religion in the late periods of ancient Egypt. Excavation continues, with recent finds including a military vessel and Greek burial grounds. Some of the collapses may have been sudden enough to drown whole districts quickly. Thonis-Heracleion is the grandest example on this list of a great city swallowed whole by the sea. And its warning is pointed, because the Nile Delta is still sinking, and the sea is still rising, which puts the modern city of Alexandria on the same slow path. Number 10. Herculaneum. Around 1 in the morning, on the night Mount Vesuvius erupted, roughly 300 people crowded into the stone boathouses along the shore of a wealthy Roman town, waiting for rescue boats that would never come, as a glowing avalanche of superheated gas poured down the mountain toward them. Herculaneum lay about 7 kilometers from Vesuvius on the Bay of Naples, and it died in the same eruption that destroyed Pompeii in 79 CE. But Herculaneum died differently. It was struck by pyroclastic surges, fast-moving clouds of scorching gas, ash, and rock during the night. It was buried under 16 to 20 meters of volcanic material, even deeper than Pompeii, and that material set into hard rock. For a long time, archaeologists thought the town had been safely evacuated, because they found very few bodies. Then, in the 1980s and 90s, excavations of the ancient shoreline boathouses changed everything. The researchers Sarah Biesel and Giuseppe Maggi uncovered more than 300 skeletons of people who had fled to the waterfront and huddled there together. They had died in moments. The surge reached temperatures around 400 to 500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to shatter skulls from the heat alone. In 2020, scientists reported an astonishing find in one victim: brain tissue that had been turned to glass by the extreme sudden heat. The real killers at Herculaneum were not the falling ash, but these searing clouds of gas. Because the deposit sealed and supported the buildings, many survived to their upper stories, and in places, Herculaneum preserves the texture of Roman daily life, even better than Pompeii does. The same heat that killed also preserved. Wooden furniture, doors, beams, and even food were carbonized and kept. In a grand house called the Villa of the Papyri, around 1,800 scrolls were charred into fragile black cylinders. For centuries, they were unreadable, and every attempt to physically unroll them destroyed the brittle carbon. Then, in 2023 and 2024, a competition called the Vesuvius Challenge began decoding them without opening them at all. Using high-resolution X-ray scanning and artificial intelligence to detect the faint traces of ink and read the letters inside the intact scrolls. It is one of the strangest gifts of the disaster. A library carbonized by a volcano and recovered nearly 2,000 years later by machine learning. Much of the buried town still lies beneath the modern city of Herculaneum, which limits how much can be dug. The eruption was described in letters by Pliny the Younger, whose uncle Pliny the Elder died trying to help, and it gave us the very term Plinian eruption. There is even a running debate over whether it happened in August or in the autumn. Herculaneum is this video's clearest case of a town dying during the night, and Vesuvius has not finished. Around 3 million people now live inside its danger zone, going to sleep each night beneath the same mountain. Number 11. Pavlopetri. In only 3 to 4 meters of clear water off southern Greece, snorkelers can glide over the streets of an entire Bronze Age town, following its roads past the outlines of houses and courtyards laid out on the sandy seabed, as if the sea had simply risen one day and never left. Pavlopetri lies off the coast of Laconia, near the island of Elefonisos, and it is one of the oldest submerged towns known anywhere in the world. People lived here from around 3,500 BCE in the late Stone Age and on through the Bronze Age. Because it rests in such shallow water, its full town plan survives, which is extraordinarily rare. It was first spotted in 1904 by the geologist Phocion Negris, then rediscovered and surveyed in 1967 by Nicholas Fleming of the University of Southampton. A Cambridge team mapped it in 1968, and from 2009, a project with the University of Nottingham, led by John Henderson, used digital survey tools and robotics to record it in 3 dimensions and build a virtual walkthrough of the drowned streets. The seabed preserves walls, courtyard houses, a network of roads, and what looks like a town square, along with more than 15 buildings and dozens of stone-lined tombs. In the Mycenaean era, this was a busy town of textiles and trade, connected across the Aegean by pottery. Its intact street grid gives archaeologists something they almost never get: a complete urban plan from the Bronze Age. The Nottingham project even used its survey data to build a full three-dimensional digital reconstruction, letting people take a virtual walk through the streets as they were before the water rose. Its ancient name is lost to us. It sank slowly through a series of earthquakes and gradual sinking of the coast, combined with rising seas, sometime around 1000 BCE or later. The Laconian coast sits near the Hellenic subduction zone, one of the most seismically active regions in Europe. Unlike the instant catastrophes elsewhere on this list, Pavlopetri was taken slowly, over generations, but the end was just as complete. A whole living town slipped beneath the waves and was very nearly forgotten. Today, its shallow depth leaves it exposed to boat anchors and storms, so the very sight that teaches us how coastlines drown is itself slowly being worn away. That is where these 11 stories converge. Fire from below, water from the sea, the ground itself, and perhaps even the sky, each of them ending a world that its people thought was permanent. When you set them side by side, a pattern appears, and it is worth looking at directly. Across all 11, the mechanisms are surprisingly few. Volcanic ash and searing gas buried Cerén, Cuicuilco, and Herculaneum. The sea rose or surged over Atlit-Yam, Helike, Doggerland, Thonis-Heracleion, and Pavlopetri. The ground itself shattered Kourion. And over tall El-Hammam, the sky may have exploded. What unites them is speed. Most of these worlds ended, not over centuries, but in hours, sometimes minutes. There is a strange gift hidden in the horror. The same burial that killed also froze daily life in place. Wet ash cast the shape of growing maize at Cerén. Airless mud kept baskets and whole longhouses at Ozette. Marine clay held skeletons in their beds at Atlit-Yam. Carbonizing heat kept an entire Roman library at Herculaneum. In every case, the very thing that ended these worlds is the reason we can study them at all, because a slow, ordinary death leaves only dust, while a sudden catastrophe seals a single moment and hands it to the future intact. Destruction and preservation turn out to be the same act. And memory survived in other ways too. In Greek myths of a drowned city. In the biblical echo some here at tall El-Hammam, and in Makkah stories of the night the ground shook. Geography ties them together as well. Kourion and Pavlopetri and Helike sit near the boundaries of grinding tectonic plates. So does Cascadia beneath Ozette, and the Dead Sea Fault beneath tall El-Hammam. These are not random spots on the map. They are the seams of the planet, the places where the crust is under the most strain, and human beings keep building thriving communities right on top of them, drawn by the same fertile soil, harbors, and springs that the geology provides. The ancients read the resulting disasters as divine punishment, the anger of Poseidon, or the judgment of a god. We read them in fault lines, ash layers, and tsunami sand. But both explanations are trying to answer the same question: why a full, living community can be gone by morning. The hardest part to hold in mind is that these were not empty ruins when disaster came. They were homes with meals cooking, harbors at rest, children asleep. The ruins are only the after, and the unsettling truth is that the story is not over. Naples still sleeps beneath Vesuvius, 3 million strong. Mexico City sprawls among its volcanoes. The eastern Mediterranean waits on the same faults that leveled Kourion, and the Pacific Northwest sits atop a Cascadia rupture that scientists consider overdue. The Nile Delta keeps sinking, pulling at Alexandria the way it once pulled down Thonis-Heracleion, while rising seas creep toward coastlines everywhere, echoing Atlit-Yam. Submarine landslides like Storegga still lurk on the ocean floor, and the same sky that may have burst over tall El-Hammam is watched now by planetary defense teams tracking every passing rock. This is exactly why archaeologists keep returning to the drowned and the buried. These sites are not just curiosities. They are natural experiments in catastrophe, recording how fast a coastline can drop, how far a tsunami can run inland, how a city responds when the ground turns to liquid. Disaster scientists study Storegga to model future submarine landslides, and they study the 365 earthquake to understand the Eastern Mediterranean's next great rupture. The dead cities are teaching the living how to survive. The lesson these drowned and buried cities offer is a humbling one. Being advanced has never meant being safe. Every one of these peoples believed their world was solid ground, permanent and reliable, the way we believe it about our own cities. What they left us, beneath the ash and the water, is both a warning and a strange comfort, because after every one of these nights, human beings came back, resettled, and rebuilt. If the deep past still has questions for you, there's another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.